Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake. There are 8 days left until Election Day. President Biden is about to speak about inflation and energy prices, and candidates and the biggest names in American politics are blitzing the campaign trail. We start this show today with breaking news on the rise of political violence in America. We just got new details about the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. Federal prosecutors this afternoon charged the assailant who broke into the Pelosi residence with attempted kidnapping and assault. The Justice Department says that law enforcement found a roll of tape, rope, and zip ties at the crime scene, along with a hammer. And officials have concluded that the intruder was planning to kidnap and to injure the Speaker of the House. Additionally, we learned from court documents that the assailant told police that his goal in breaking into the Pelosi residence was to question Speaker Pelosi, saying that if she lied to him, he would break her kneecaps. The intruder told police that breaking Pelosi's kneecaps would send a message to other members of Congress that their actions had consequences. A source tells NBC News that Paul Pelosi is still in the ICU. And we've also heard from a source that he was able to give his version of events to investigators yesterday. These new and disturbing developments come as NBC News has further learned that on the same day Pelosi was attacked, federal domestic security agencies issued a bulletin warning of an elevated threat of violence directed at election workers and politicians as the midterms approach. That bulletin says that the threat is being driven by divisive topics linked to the election and to the perception of fraud in the 2020 elections. In other words, it's our nasty, toxic, vitriolic political landscape. President Biden addressed the current threat environment when he spoke at a Democratic event on Friday night.
There's too much violence, political violence, too much hatred, too much vitriol. And what makes us think that one party can talk about stolen elections, COVID being a hoax, there's all a bunch of lies, and it not affect people who may not be so well balanced? What makes us think that it's not going to corrode the political climate? Enough is enough is enough.
NBC's Tom Winter is following the latest with the investigation. NBC's Mara Barrett is in San Francisco with the latest on Paul Pelosi's condition. And NBC's Ken Delaney covers the Justice Department and joins me here on set. Tom, I'm going to start with you, though. You've been working on your investigative sources on this story for days. Tell me about what you've learned.
Well, I think a couple of things are important here. You laid out perfectly the timeline. According to that criminal complaint that was filed in the Northern District of California today, making these 2 charges against David DePape, 42. We now know that he lives in a garage in an area in the San Francisco area. When agents searched that garage on Saturday, according to the court paperwork, Garrett, they found a sword. They found additional hammers in there. They found more tape inside of there. They also found some personal effects, which they say confirms that that's where he was actually living. So he did have other weapons with him. He had 2 hammers that they say he brought to the house. They had zip ties that were found in a backpack. At some point, he brought the zip ties into the Pelosi bedroom with Paul Pelosi. The intent there, as we first reported back on Friday, was to perhaps detain Paul Pelosi until Speaker Pelosi came home. Now, of course, when Speaker Pelosi would have arrived at the house, had this actually even occurred, she would have been there with U.S. Capitol Police officers, which, given what they're armed with and given a person armed with a hammer, that probably was not going to continue much longer. But either way, this kind of lays out the sequence of events. I thought another important line in there is a lot of the information that we're getting that you were referencing, Garrett, comes from a statement in a series of interviews that he did with the San Francisco Police Department post Miranda warning, and it was recorded. So they have those comments in perpetuity. And I think a key part of that is he said, look, you know, just the British fought tyranny. And that's what I believe in. And so he was hell-bent on this continuing forward. He knew the police were going to arrive because he knew that Paul Pelosi made the call to 911. And even then, he later told police, according to this criminal complaint, that it didn't faze him, that he thought that this was his mission. So clearly somebody who had a very specific ideology and thought process here. We don't know what specific questions he was going to ask the Speaker of the House. And, of course, all this comes in the backdrop of so much of what you were talking about, the continued threats to Congress, something I know you're going to get to and talk about further. But I think in this immediate instance, it raises questions as to, for these high-level members of Congress, and we've seen a number of instances of violence over the years, some targeting Republicans as well, do they need more security? Do they need say, a marked local police unit at a house, even when that particular member of Congress isn't there because perhaps their family members are there? What else needs to happen as we head into these midterm elections? A lot of polarization in this country, probably the biggest understatement that's come out of my mouth. And so I think when you look at this in totality, Garrett, I think this is going to raise a lot of questions, not only about this particular instance, but where we go from here.
Those security questions are going to be a big part of my day job, I imagine, here coming up on Capitol Hill. Tom, real quick, I mean, given what appears to be the pretty comprehensive nature of this man's comments to authorities, the interview and so forth after the fact, doesn't seem like there's much further investigative work to go here. Am I wrong?
I think a little bit, because I think some of the things that they're going to want to do is continue to go through the blog posts, the social media posts, his background, his history, continue interviews with people that may have known him more recently. All that's going to be coupled in there. This is only a 6 or 7 page criminal complaint. They're going to indict him at some point. I suspect that that'll be more voluminous in nature. More of his statements might be included in that. So, yeah, I think there is actually a lot more investigative work to do. And while undoubtedly they've looked at whatever security camera video that they've been able to gather up so far, and certainly listen to that 911 call from the Pelosi residence, from Paul Pelosi's cell phone, they're going to want to go through and transcribe that. They're going to want to go through every item of video. Had this person been to the house before, to see where it was located? When had they been there? What other types of activity did they see? So, yes, perhaps the bulk of the investigation is done, but I think there's a lot more work to do to present this for trial.
Tom Winter, thank you very much. And Mara, you're on the ground in San Francisco. What are you learning from police there about the state of their investigation? And also, what are we learning about Paul Pelosi's condition at this hour?
Well, Garrett, in addition to the federal charges that we've just learned about, we are expecting new state charges to come down from the district attorney as well. I spoke with her over the weekend, and she will be doing a press conference to announce those charges this afternoon on the West Coast. She intends to bring attempted homicide charges, as well as assault with a deadly weapon, burglary, elder abuse, other felonies in association with the attack on Friday. And we've learned more details about how exactly the attack happened in the Department of Justice's complaint, right? We learned the attacker broke through a back glass door, came up the stairs, and surprised Mr. Pelosi where he was sleeping in his bedroom, and told him to wake up, that he was looking for Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And when we spoke with police over the weekend, they detailed the life-saving action that they said Mr. Pelosi did by making that 911 call, but also crediting the 911 dispatcher for being able to read between the lines, hear what the conversation was between Mr. Pelosi and the suspect, David DePape. And she elevated that call so that officers could arrive within minutes. And of course, that's all when the attack ended up happening. DePape saying that everything was fine once officers arrived, but once officers asked him to put the hammer down that the two men were holding together, that's when he struck Mr. Pelosi in the head. The DOJ complaint detailing that he had appeared unconscious while they arrested the suspect. Now, we do know that while Mr. Pelosi is recovering in the ICU at this hour, Nancy Pelosi leaving here just within the last few hours to go and spend time with him at the hospital. He is expected to make a full recovery. He's recovering from surgery for a fractured skull, and he's also got serious injuries to his right arm and hands. But we have learned from sources familiar with the interviews that he's done with the San Francisco police, as well as the FBI, other officials, that he is awake now. He's talking. He did these interviews to give his version of the stories, and he appears to remember everything that went on Friday, and doctors saying that he does appear to have all of his cognitive abilities. Nancy Pelosi released a statement over the weekend saying that she was heartbroken and traumatized over this violent attack, but obviously good news. And as Nancy Pelosi pointed out in her statement, that his condition is improving as we do wait for more details from the district attorney on those state charges.
Yeah, good to hear that news about his condition. There's no such thing as minor surgery when you're 82 years old. Mara Barrett for us in San Francisco. Thank you. Ken, I want to turn to you. When people may have left this story on Friday, it seemed like the DOJ was not yet involved. This was a local investigation, a state investigation. Now the feds have gotten into the game here a little bit. What does the DOJ's involvement mean for the future of whatever case may be being built here?
So there will be 2 prosecutions, and this is a very significant move by the Justice Department. They've charged him with attempted kidnapping, but also with this rarely used charge of assaulting the close relative of a federal officer to intimidate that officer and impede that officer from performing his or her duties. It's the kind of charge that they would have brought had any of the January 6th rioters managed to get access to members of Congress and harm them. And it carries 30 years in prison. So it's a big deal. It suggests that the Justice Department views this as a political act and wants to send a message that they're going to bring the full weight of justice against whoever tries to do things like that.
I was going to say, is there a deterrent effect from a charge like that in this political environment that we're in, where there is so much concern about other violence, for the DOJ to say, look, we're not leaving this as some local assault case. We're taking this to the maximum degree we can? I
think that's absolutely correct. And especially when given the context of this person and his delusional writings, and you can make an argument that he doesn't have all his faculties, didn't know what he was doing. The Justice Department is not considering that. They are bringing the full weight of these very serious charges.
Let's talk about the broader threat environment, this bulletin that came out from FBI and DHS late last week in sort of warning about the broader threat environment. Talk me through a little bit of what that means as we head into this final sprint towards the election, because it is very timing-based around the election.
Yeah, this was the kind of intelligence bulletin that probably should have been written before January 6th. It's based on the same kind of information, not specific enough to be actionable, but just a lot of social media chatter. In this case, it's threats to the election. And what they're saying is that election administrators, election workers, politicians are at heightened risk of being attacked by domestic violent extremists. And they're saying that those people are acting based on this narrative of fraud in the 2020 election. They don't call it bogus. We know it's a bogus narrative. Sure. And the thing about this document is that you could write 5 of these about various different conspiracy theories that are coursing through social media, including some of the ones invoked by this Pelosi assailant.
When you talk about the idea that the threats are non-specific, I wonder if there's a certain CYA element to this from the federal government. Are there resources that come with this? Or there be stepped-up patrols, stepped-up some kind of federal deterrent effect around protecting election workers or politicians? Or is this, these agencies saying, look, we gave you some kind of warning and now you're on your own?
There's certainly an element of that, absolutely. But this is an unclassified intelligence bulletin that goes to all levels of law enforcement. So the idea is to put them on heightened alert, that things that are First Amendment protected, it's not against the law to criticize election workers, or even to wish harm on election workers, as vile as that is. But it's the idea is to get the local police forces to pay closer attention to people who are doing that, knowing that there is a potential for violence here.
All right, Ken Delanian, thank you for that. I know we'll be following this closely in the days to come. And now, for more on the state of political violence in America, I'm joined by the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats at the University of Chicago, Robert Pape. So, Professor, let me start with you on this first, just your reaction to these new details about the attack on Paul Pelosi and on the attacker's plan specifically. What does that information tell you about the kind of rhetoric that this person has internalized somehow?
The more we've learned about this attack, the more it is an act of political violence, and the more it confirms the warnings that we gave just a few weeks ago about the rise of political violence during this election season, based on our most recent national surveys on violent sentiments in the general population. Unfortunately, all the characteristics that we are learning from the interview that this assailant gave to the police about the right-wing conspiracy theory, his intent to not just attack and harm the Speaker of the House, but to do so because of her lies, and also to send signals to other Democrats, and then to liken himself to a patriot in the American Revolution, fighting against tyranny from the Democrats. This is all in line with our national survey showing that millions of Americans harbor violent sentiments, and they are opposed to those elections that they lost.
Let's talk about that survey here. It says that 5% of Americans say that political violence would be justified, in this case, to return Trump to the presidency. Can you walk us through how you reached the conclusions that you did and what these results say about the larger political environment we're all living in?
Yes, this is the gold standard of surveys. I'm sure your listeners get inundated with polls at this point. These are $100,000 surveys. These are those that are very expensive to do, and they're representative of the general population. And what we did is we asked numerous questions about support for the use of force for political causes. And what you see is that the equivalent of 5% or 13 million American adults agree that the use of force is justified to support Trump. Well, Trump, of course, has been vehemently against Nancy Pelosi in almost every single rally that he gives every week. And if you look deeper, you'll see in our survey that what are the things that really drive this? Well, it's the idea of the great replacement, which you see in this attacker with his defense of Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. It's also the idea of QAnon, the immoral leaders running our country. You see this in the social media of the assailant. Well, these are the critical beliefs driving not just voting support for Trump, but violent support for Trump. And it's exactly what President Biden was talking about in the front end of your show, which is the environment that is being poisoned by not just fear-mongering in general, but specifically focused conspiracy theories targeting Democrats. And it should be no wonder that what we're seeing is a rise of political violence against not just any Democrat, but number two in line of succession for the presidency. This is extremely serious, and unfortunately, we're just at the beginning of this election season.
When you talk about issues like this with Republicans, you often hear, oh, yeah, but there's violence from the left, too. Did your research uncover any similar trend or any other 13 million people on the left who are advised in this way?
We are a bipartisan organization, and we also study violent sentiments on the left. And yes, there are millions of Americans on the left who would support violence to stop, say, police brutality against minorities. The crucial difference, though, is that it's on the right that we have political leaders stoking those fires. There are commercials with Republican candidates with guns shooting at targets saying they're going rhino hunting or hunting Pelosi. Well, that's not happening on the left with those leaders. So this is it's not just the violent sentiments, it's the lightning strikes that are happening by the rhetoric, by the leaders of the Republican Party, many of them, and also popular media figures on conservative mainstream media vocalizing those very same sentiments. This is what is driving not just anger, but violent anger, pushing volatile people to take that awful next step.
It's a fascinating study and well worth your time to go read the whole thing for folks at home. Robert Pape, thank you for joining us. And coming up, voters, poll workers, lawmakers, all on edge with just 8 days to go until Election Day. We are live on the campaign trail and at the big board. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. With just 8 days now, 8 days until the midterms, let's turn to the latest from the campaign trail amid this uneasy environment we've just been describing. Steve Kornacki is here in our D.C. studio. He's going to join us in just a moment, hard at work, getting the big board ready. But let's start in Arizona, a hotbed of election denialism in its own right, where a federal judge has now declined to ban an activist group from gathering near ballot boxes, arguing that their actions did not rise to the level of intimidation. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is on the ground for us in Arizona. He's at a Kerry Lake for Governor event, I believe. So, Vaughn, who or what has been driving these poll watchers, and what can you tell us about the court decision and how it's being felt there?
Yeah, we're actually at a Kerry Lake Town Hall right now. Garrett, you said it there, and so I'm going to do my best inside voice here. It's not to distract everybody in the room. But when we're talking about what we're watching over the course of especially evenings at these drop boxes are individuals who are coming out and essentially videographing or taking photos of folks, either license plates or essentially watching to make sure that they're not stuffing multiple boxes into these drop boxes here. And where is the inspiration of this? I mean, this goes back to the spring springtime when Carrie Lake herself was urging folks saying that we need to bring our sleeping bags out and we need to go and watch these drop boxes. Essentially, they make the case that so-called mules were heavily behind the 2020 election, that helped in their allegations, which of course has been debunked repeatedly, that ultimately that they swung the election here in Arizona in favor of Joe Biden. And so what is happening here is you see that these individuals uploading photos and then social media influencers on the right, especially on Truth Social, Donald Trump's social media company, platform essentially these conspiracy theories. And then Donald Trump himself has reposted 7 of these particular things himself there, including that one specific Dropbox in Mesa. And so that is where you saw the courts here have determined that they say that make the claim that at this point, while there are serious questions in the judge's own words about the efforts of those individuals at the Dropboxes, right now the judge said that he does not feel comfortable infringing, again on his words, on the core constitutional rights of those who are watching to ensure, as these individuals allege, the security of the elections.
Vaughn, the Secretary of State's office there has received complaints about voter intimidation around these drop boxes. Are local authorities concerned about the possibility of escalation around this?
Yeah, and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Paul Penzone has actually spoken out frustrated that they have put additional resources to essentially protect individuals who are coming to vote. You have seen individuals that have showed up masked and armed, and that is where you're going to see more drop boxes open up over the course of this next week. And of course, if this sort of action is being seen this early on here, the concern from local law enforcement is what could take place next week around Election Day itself, Garrett.
Vaughn, if NBC News Now ever gets golf rights, I think you have proven you are more than capable of calling a game or a match where you can speak quietly while the action is going on behind you. Vaughn Hilliard in Arizona, thank you. And joining us now with a look at the current state of play overall, with just 8 days to go, from the Washington big board is NBC's Steve Kornacki. So, Steve, obviously an uneasy environment with 8 days out. Give us kind of the broad picture of where we stand now.
Yeah, I think you're right. Uneasy. It's a little confusing, I think. And some past recent midterm elections, I think it's been clear at this point. But I'll show you where the confusion comes from. First of all, here, take a look at the generic ballot. This is where you ask folks, do you want the Democrats or the Republicans to be controlling Congress? And it's kind of all over the place in terms of what you can see here. This is the Real Clear Politics average. Now, they have their average of polls gives Republicans about a 3-point advantage, 2.9 on the generic ballot. That would be a lead probably enough to give the Republicans the House, although in some of these recent midterm waves we've seen, that's also a smaller number than we've seen for some other parties at this point. But it's not what we're seeing everywhere, because if you look at the 538 average, they have a bit of a different formula, a few different polls between these two averages. They have it at Republicans by 0.8 of 1 point. We said, well, let's just take a look. Let's take every poll that was taken in the last 2 weeks. Let's average them together. What would that look like? That would have it at Republicans by 0.4 of a point. So there's a big range here, I think, relatively speaking, where it looks like there's some kind of Republican edge. But that Republican edge in the polling is not on the same level as we've seen in some of these huge wave years that Democrats and Republicans have had in the last 2 decades or so. And there's a big difference between Republicans winning by 3 points and Republicans winning by 0.5 point, just in terms of what that would mean for the House, what that would mean for the Senate. So the generic ballot is sending some mixed signals. And then there's this. This is new from Gallup. They ask folks the issues they consider the most important, very important. And you see the economy tops it, abortion second, crime, gun policy, immigration. Then you ask folks who say these are the most important issues to them how they intend to vote. And I think this is interesting, too, because look at this. On all but one of these topics, Republicans have an advantage. And on 3 of them, the economy, crime, immigration, Republicans have massive advantages over Democrats. So when you look at this issue set, you look at how these voters are breaking along these issues, you see what looks like a significant Republican advantage. But again, you go back to that generic ballot, and this is not right now looking like a runaway in the polls for Republicans.
Crime has been the sleeper issue when I go out and talk to voters in some of these states. You know, it's not scientific, but it's just one of those things that keeps coming up that I feel like maybe we miss in some of our conversations otherwise. Steve, you've got this new podcast coming out about the sort of political it wasn't violence at the time, but the rise of political rhetoric even in the 90s. Do you see similarities between the kind of Gingrich Republican revolution and what we're seeing now? What's the same, what's different in these two political moments?
Yeah, it's the podcast, thank you for mentioning, is called The Revolution, and it's about the 1994 midterm election. And to put this in some context here, control of the House, when it's changed. You go back 1954, Republicans lost a majority they'd had for 2 years. They lost it to the Democrats. And then for 40 straight years, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. They started calling it the Permanent Democratic Congress. Republicans were never even close to a majority. And the podcast tells the story of how in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, Newt Gingrich came to Washington and he had a vision of nationalizing politics. He saw that the media was evolving, national media, cable news, that sort of thing was starting up. And he saw a possibility in nationalizing politics that could, he thought, give Republicans a majority in the House. And lo and behold, in 1994, it was a shocking midterm election. For those who remember it, that Republicans gained 54 seats and got the House. And I think, and this is what the podcast is about, that 94 is kind of the origin story for our politics now, because it was the first truly nationalized midterm election. And since 1994, changing hands in the House, no longer that uncommon. In 2006, Republicans lost it to the Democrats. In 10, Democrats lost it to the Republicans. In 18, Republicans lost it to the Democrats. In 22, with just a gain of 5 seats, Republicans could win it back. This could be the 5th time, really, since 94 that we've seen the House change hands in the midterm election. Before 94, it had been decades. It had been generations. I think 94 was a key turning point in nationalizing our politics. And the podcast, I hope you give it a listen, tells you the story of how that happened.
What's interesting to me, especially when you put it in the context of like the Pelosi attack and the talk about tyranny, I can see how you would be frustrated with 40 years of Democratic rule. But if we're coming up on maybe a 3rd straight change election, the system's working in the sense of if you're angry, you can flip the House. You can change things pretty quick if you really want to.
No party. I mean, you go back and you look at Republicans in the 70s and 80s, and so many of them felt it was impossible.
Right.
They were just resigned to being in the minority. That's the thing now. Democrats, Republicans, they lose power. They have that feeling right away. We can get it right back in 2-4 years.
And they have been.
Yep.
All right, Steve Kornacki, thank you. About to be the busiest man in television. He talked about it. The new podcast, The Revolution, takes a dive into the origin story of partisan politics as we know it. All 6 episodes are available today, so you get it. Get ready to binge listen. I'll be listening on my drive home today. And Steve will be back tomorrow, along with Chuck and Kristen, for special coverage of the midterm elections, 1 week out, featuring 10 reporters reporting from 10 key states. They'll be breaking down everything you need to know about the most crucial races. Don't miss it, right here on NBC News Now at 8 p.m. And up next, Republicans rally around election-denying candidates with just 8 days until the midterms. My panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we mentioned, threats to democracy are a key concern for voters ahead of next week's elections, but are they an issue that will change many hearts and minds heading into the midterms? On that question, I want to show you some of Chuck Todd's interview with New Hampshire's Republican Governor Chris Sununu yesterday on Meet the Press. Now, Sununu himself is not an election denier, but he is backing his party's Senate candidate, who is. Chuck pressed him about it on the show.
Why are you supporting an election denialist? And do you think the inflation issue is enough to sort of rationalize support for somebody who thinks school buses of voters are going to show up in New Hampshire?
Yeah. Yeah, let me tell you, you're in a bubble, man. I love you, Chuck, but you are in a bubble if you think anybody is talking about what happened in 2020 or talking about Mar-a-Lago and all that. I know the press loves to talk about it. People are talking about what is happening in their pocketbooks every single day.
Look, I get
when
that,
they have
Governor.
to buy groceries or fill up gas. Or right now,
well, that
far outweighs.
Over election denialism. Okay.
How could they? Of course. Oh, my gosh, Chuck, this is hitting people. They're having trouble paying their mortgage. They're having trouble making car payments because of bad policies out of Washington. Should they be? That is, look, the beauty of the American system is every voter has the right and almost the responsibility to be selfish with their vote, to vote in terms of what is best for their family.
Agree.
Joining me now on set is Eugene Scott, national political reporter for The Washington Post, Joe Crowley, former Democratic congressman from New York City, and Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. So, Eugene, I'll start with you. I mean, you heard Chuck's exchange there with Governor Sununu. What do you make of that? Is sort of the defense of democracy, political violence question part of a bubble?
Well, I don't think it is. I mean, I think there are voters across this country who do care about what's happening in terms of democracy. And people have different ideas about what democracy, protecting democracy means depending on where you fall on, you know, the political spectrum. But inflation is a very real issue for lots of voters, Republicans and Democrats, and that's something that they are going to be factoring in when they vote.
Sarah, during the clip, you sort of mouthed the idea that this was a presidential answer from Governor Sununu. Do you like that answer politically? What does it say to you that he's trying to kind of wall off the idea of election-related violence and focus just so narrowly on these economic issues?
Well, he's focusing, yes, it sounded like presidential, and he's focusing on the economic issues because that's what's playing right now, and that's why the Republicans are going to have a small red wave coming.
You've got some of your, Republican Main Street folks, I'm thinking of someone like Peter Meyer, who just lost his reelection campaign, who have tried to do both. They've tried to do kind of traditional Republican economic arguments, but also, voted for impeachment and speak out against political violence. How do you think Republican candidates in particular should balance those conflicting issues in the American mindset? Right now, they should talk about the economy and crime, and then focus on democracy come January when we have power to do something about it. As we speak right now, President Biden has started giving some remarks on the economy. We are listening to those in our control room, and we're going to bring you any news as they come. But, Joe, I want to come to you. We've got Elaine Luria, who's fighting for her reelection life in Virginia, one of the only Democrats who's really put money behind a message about political violence. I want to play you some of her ad and talk about it on the other side.
If you're looking for someone who'll just say anything just to win, I'm not your candidate. If you support insurrectionists or call our military weak, I'm not your candidate. If you attack the FBI and defend Donald Trump, I'm not your candidate. And if you believe the 2020 election was stolen, definitely not your candidate.
So what do you make of this? She's on the January 6th committee. Is this someone who's in for a penny, in for a pound, or is this a viable kind of closing strategy here that might actually move votes?
I think it's a combination of both. I think you saw the same thing, in terms of others on the committee as well. But that, she's actually speaking the truth. This is, I think, something she really believes, given her background. This is something she's all in on. And I do think what you saw in terms of Sununu was a bit of a hamana moment because, I could actually feel the sweat and I could feel the heat coming from him because he was under stress. That's a tough question, in terms of how can you say one thing yet support candidates who completely disagree with you, or at least are willing to mouth these disagreements and these false truths.
Well, and the idea of we'll talk about this when we're in power, requires a lot of suspension and a lot of trust that may not be built up. Now, somebody like Sununu, who's been reelected in New Hampshire, kind of has that there, might be a different political animal than some first-time House candidates who just say, we're not going to talk about this. Eugene, Barack Obama thinks this is a pretty good closing message. He's been talking about this issue on the trail. I want to play some of what he has said about this particular issue. Take a listen.
Right now, today, democracy might not seem like a top priority, especially because people have other things to worry about. You might just say, I don't have time to think about something so abstract like democracy. But you know what? We've seen throughout history what happens when we lose democracy.
This feels like the heart of the debate. I mean, the former president there is talking about a kind of a broad scope of an issue. Republicans are saying, yeah, but eggs are $6, right? But Barack Obama's won election to the presidency twice. This is a guy whose political instincts are pretty well in tune. What do you make of the way he is shaping this message? Is he a particularly good messenger for it, or is this something that maybe other Democrats might be wise to follow his example?
Well, I think if you look at some of the places he's shared this message in Milwaukee and Atlanta, he's trying to turn out some voters that might not turn out who know the history points that he mentioned regarding voting rights. These are things that not all Americans have always had for a long time. And he's telling these voters, particularly black voters in Milwaukee, black voters in Atlanta, that you need to show up because if you don't, we could get people in office who do not protect your voting rights. And so that's why he's taken that particular message to those particular groups.
Sarah?
But what we're seeing in our polling is we've always had democracy, and a lot of people really don't believe we're going to lose it.
Is that a concern, though? I mean, you can only defend democracy with your vote before you lose democracy.
Right, but they really don't believe we're going to lose that. You know, we've been on this cusp before in this country. We've always come through it. They believe they're going to come through it, but they are struggling with the gas prices and the egg prices.
Yes. But I would add to that point. They are struggling. There's no question about that. We all see that. And you know, when you're the party in power, you're going to be blamed for the good and for the bad. We get that as well. But these times do come and go. What doesn't come and go is democracy.
Yeah.
Either you have it or you don't have it. If you lose it, it's hard to get it back. And so I do think that that's what he's talking to. So going back to Luria, it's the same message. It's like, you know, it's almost to the point, if you don't believe in the things I'm talking about, then maybe you really shouldn't vote for me because this is what I'm for. It really lays it out in a stark way. And I think it does motivate some folks who otherwise would sit on the sidelines, not care to vote at all. But if they do, maybe you are touching pulling some heartstrings there.
I was talking to a Republican strategist a week or so ago who was working on the race in Nevada where this has become a bit of it's not the primary issue, but it's a bit of an issue here. And the strategist said to me, yeah, Democrats are going to talk about this because it's that much harder to make an economic argument when you've been in power, that Republicans look at this as Democrats just trying to swing the spotlight somewhere else when they've had power in Washington for the last 2 years. What do you make of that argument?
Democrats are having a hard time communicating their economic message, and why is not completely clear. When you look at some of the data, things are not consistently as bad as Republican critics say they are. Why Democrats haven't been able to get that message through, despite what has actually happened, remains unclear to a lot of people, especially voters who want to support them.
And on that point, this October was the best October, just reported, since 1976 in terms of the stock market. It's just remarkable. To your point, we're not conveying enough of that.
Well, this White House has made the decision not to rise and fall on the stock market like the last White House did. Sarah, I want to ask you one more question before we have to go, because along with this discussion of political violence, there has been this creeping rise in anti-Semitism. And there's a school of thought here that says if you don't start calling out one, people start kind of testing the fences and seeing what they can get away with. Do you worry that the Republican Party broadly's refusal to engage in kind of their own, to shut down their own worst behaving people, and I'm not suggesting that it's Republicans who are behind the anti-Semitism across the board, or certainly not, but that it kind of creates a culture of like, we're all just going to stay in our lanes and nobody's going to call out anybody for this kind of bad behavior?
And that maybe is wrong, but that's exactly what they're doing. And it's a winning for them, so they're going to keep doing that.
Any thought on that, Joe? I was thinking about Sununu saying, you got to vote aggressively on your own issues. It feels like ignoring the plight of others is a dangerous
I, for one, believe that there are certain issues that you need to stand up for, need to be accountable for. I think democracy is certainly one of those. I think that hate speech is certainly one of those. Things that divide our nation, things that tear us apart. We need healthy parties. And particularly, I think, the Republican Party. We need a healthy Republican Party. I want to beat the Republican Party, but I want them to be healthy when I do it.
You'd rather beat Joe O'Dea in Colorado, or you'd rather beat... I mean, this is the challenge, right? Because the folks who might make a healthier Republican Party are also getting beat in a lot of these polls. The folks who are winning, or on the cusp of winning, seem to be some of the Trumpiest.
I'm not
sure
Sarah?
Yeah, well, I know you don't... I'm looking at these Senate races anyway.
Well, and Main Street in the House, we're going to have over 100 members for the first time in the history of the Republican-Main Street Partnership.
An opportunity to throw your weight around.
Exactly. And there's we have a gentleman coming from Rhode Island and Oregon. I mean, we have places, and these people are conservatives, but they want to work with the Democrats and get things done.
All right, I've got to leave it there. Eugene, Joe, Sarah, thank you all. We invoked President Biden's name. He's speaking a few moments ago at the White House, slamming the oil industry for their record profits. And when you talk about Joe Biden, you often find Mike Memoli nearby. He's at his post at the White House with more. Mike, what are we learning?
Well, Garrett, I heard you just a few minutes ago say that the White House does not necessarily believe that Americans are tracking the stock market as it relates to the political environment. But if you follow Ron Klain, the White House chief of staff, on Twitter, you know for sure that this White House believes there is a great correlation between the price of gas and voter sentiment. So that's why we saw the White House add an event that wasn't originally on the guidance for the president to talk about what he just characterized a few moments ago as excessive oil profits at a time when the American consumer has really been crushed by the price at the pump. And he put on the table something which I think the mood of Capitol Hill right now to do anything in the lame duck more than what they need to do, the bare necessities in the lame duck. But he said if these oil companies do not return some of these excessive profits that they've just been reporting, either in the form of rebates to consumers, lower prices, or expanding oil production, that he would ask Congress to consider what some call a windfall profits tax. That is, when they see these kinds of record profits from oil companies, they have to pay a higher price to the U.S. Treasury. This is the White House, as I say, looking at the ability of the president to get out and deliver a political message on a day when he's not hitting the road. We're going to see that again on Wednesday on infrastructure.
A windfall tax long advocated by one Bernard Sanders, who's been out on the campaign trail a lot these last couple of weeks. Mike Memoli at the White House, thank you. And after the break, no running water for 80% of Kyiv after Russian strikes destroyed critical infrastructure there. The latest on the war, along with new reporting on a contentious phone call between Presidents Biden and Zelenskyy over military aid. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. A wave of missile strikes hit multiple cities across Ukraine early this morning, striking critical infrastructure and threatening Ukraine's already fragile utility systems. This despite Ukraine's armed forces intercepting 44 of the more than 50 missiles launched by Russia. Ukraine's prime minister says 18 facilities, most of which were energy facilities, were damaged in the attack. Civilians across the country continue to live without essential services. The mayor of Kyiv says 350,000 homes in the capital city have lost power, and 80% of the city is without running water. The U.S. ambassador to Ukraine tweeted early this morning that, like Ukrainian civilians, embassy personnel were also sheltering amid what she called Russia's callous and barbaric missile strikes. I'm joined now by NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube. And Courtney, you've got some new reporting today about a phone call over the summer between President Biden and President Zelenskyy. What happened between the two leaders? Is there a breach here?
Yeah, that's right. So this call occurred in June, and it was when President Biden was explaining to President Zelenskyy that the U.S. was providing about $1 billion in additional aid and equipment and weapons to the Ukrainian military. Now, according to a number of officials who are familiar with this call, President Zelenskyy then continued to tell President Biden about additional weapons and equipment that the Ukrainian military needed. President Biden, according to these officials, eventually got frustrated and just lost his temper and explained to President Zelenskyy, look, the American people are being very generous, sending you billions of dollars of equipment, aid, and dedicating hours and hours and hours of military time and civilian time to help the Ukrainians win this war against Russia. And President Zelenskyy just needed to be more grateful about it, especially in public, if he wanted the American people to continue to support this effort. Now, the officials also told us that since this call back in June, the relationship seems to have changed a bit, that President Zelenskyy understood what President Biden meant, that he read the room, according to one official who we spoke with, and that since then, now President Zelenskyy is very positive and very grateful about the U.S. support in public.
And are both parties here confident? There's been some talk about Republicans maybe being less willing to, pay these kind of big packages. Are both of those presidents confident that that support will continue from the U.S.?
So according to the U.S. officials we've spoken with here, they are all on board with this. There is no one in the White House, according to a number of officials we spoke to for this story, and then are continuing reporting on Ukraine. They are all in on continuing to support Ukraine for the long term. And one way we can look at for this is some of these USAI, the U.S. Assistance to Ukraine Initiative. Some of these packages that they're announcing now, they're going to go on for years, Garrett.
And we'll be talking about it in the lame duck for sure. Courtney, thank you. And still to come, a national campaign is recruiting veterans and their family members to become the next generation of poll workers. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Despite concerns of political violence and threats to poll workers, thankfully some Americans are still interested in working the polls on November 8th. In fact, the city of Milwaukee just announced they're fully staffed ahead of Election Day. That's something that's never happened before. The increased numbers are thanks in part to organizations like Vet the Vote, which recruits veterans to volunteer as election workers. This year alone, Vet the Vote has signed up 63,000 poll workers. The group was on the field at a recent NFL game, showcasing its work with the league to get out their message to veterans across the country. Last week, Chuck Todd talked with Anil Nathan and Ellen Gustafson, the co-executive directors of Vet the Vote. He started the conversation asking about the importance of veterans serving their country again, now in a different role.
We know that there's a national challenge that we face in filling these incredibly critical roles of poll workers to make sure that our elections run as smoothly as possible. And like you said, what better group of people to tap into to fill those roles than veterans and military family members who have already demonstrated a commitment to our democracy and our country. So this is just a new way for them to serve again.
You know, and Ellen, I like to remind people that, you know, unlike most American families that don't serve, military families, they're not bipartisan, they're nonpartisan because you're serving no matter who's president. And you sort of, the longer you're a military family, the more you sort of appreciate that. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think one of the unique elements of military families is that we don't live in a social media silo. I mean, I have friends from all different backgrounds. I'm out here in Las Vegas at the Military Influencer Conference with military spouse and veteran business owners. We're a very multifaceted community, and all of us know people from all different backgrounds and across the aisle. So I think we're used to working together for a common mission that has nothing to do with party.
I love what you just put there. Anil, the bubble bursters, right? Military veterans, they're the bubble bursters. We all live in these bubbles and these silos, and you're so right. You know, my close friends that are veterans, they almost have a better perspective of the political divide sometimes than those that live in their bubble.
Yeah, I mean, I think better understanding, but also just a greater appreciation of what unites us, right? As Ellen was mentioning, when you wear the uniform, it doesn't matter what the person to your left or person to your right that you're serving with, what their political beliefs are. What matters is that you care about this country and you decided to, you know, wear a uniform to serve it. And so that's exactly the type of service gene that we're trying to tap into with both veterans and military family members.
I know you guys are teaming up with the NFL, and in that sense, it can sometimes give more attention to this. Ellen, tell me about how much success have you had, because I still hear about this poll worker issue across the country.
We are thrilled that we have been able to recruit over 63,000 veterans and military family members to be poll workers, which is what we learned when we started this campaign in July is about half of the total need to fill the American, elections in this 2022 cycle. So we're really super proud of that.
And Anil, what do you hope the NFL partnership brings you?
Yeah, so, I mean, the NFL partnership has already given us a great channel to reach all different kind of aspects and parts of America to recruit and get the message out. As Ellen was mentioning, I think that's a core part of why we've been so successful to this point. But I think more broadly, it's an opportunity to tell Americans that veterans and military family members are serving again, and this is just another way to believe in the integrity and strength of our elections and just strengthening our democracy as a whole.
Ellen, I know you're sensitive to one other thing here about this program, and I want to deal with it here, which is this is not about militarizing the polls and any of that. You know, nobody wants active duty military. This is not what we're talking about here. But just to talk about that sensitivity, I know you wanted to make sure we brought that up.
Yeah, it's really important to remember that, training for being a poll worker is done at the very local level across over 3,000 jurisdictions. And that training is things like handing out the right pen and checking people's ID appropriately. None of that is about any sense of protecting or using your actual, military skills in that way. The military skills it does use is knowing how to get the job done, knowing how to work together with a lot of different people, and putting the mission, which is safe and fair elections, above everything else. You know,
Anil, this idea of sort of our civic duty, I almost view this as somewhat of a civic duty. What other organizations do you hope to partner with going forward? I'll tell you one idea I've always wanted to have is give me AP Civics high school students, right, as our next round of poll workers. I could see you guys partnering with them, and that would be quite a powerhouse. Military veterans and rising citizens.
I love that idea. And, we have built a pretty incredible coalition of partners over the course of this first Vet the Vote campaign. 31 organizations that span the VSO kind of space, from IAVA and AMVETS to, as you mentioned, the NFL, the Chamber of Commerce. So really a cross-section of a lot of different parts of this country. And to your point, there's a lot more to do, right? We want to make this a norm of service for veterans and military family members moving forward, but also we want to identify other opportunities to bring the veteran and military family community, to the table to engage on civics with high schoolers, with the rest of the country more broadly.
Look, I think the military community is the last community that has trust in this country right now. So I am so glad you're using it for good here. And Neil Nathan, Ellen Gustafson. It's called Vet the Vote.
Chuck on Vet the Vote. That's going to do it for this hour. Kristen Welker will be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. And then Chuck will join her for special midterm coverage of the elections 1 week out from Election Day at 8 p.m. Don't miss that. Tom Costello picks up News Now coverage right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.